Usually changing a society is, it's like an engine repair. You turn the machine off, you swap out the broken part, and you turn it back on.
Right, a clean break, you have a revolution, the dust settles, and then you draft a brand new constitution from scratch.
Yeah, exactly. But in ancient Arabia, the Prophet Muhammad had to rebuild the economic engine while the car was driving like 80 miles an hour. He had to dismantle a deeply predatory, entrenched financial system without collapsing the entire civilization. I mean, people still needed to eat.
Caravans still had to move.
Right. So today, we're looking at how we actually pulled off this structural tightrope walk by prohibiting riba, which translates to usury or interest. Welcome to our custom-tailored deep dive into this topic. I'm your host, and let's just jump right in.
And I'm your resident expert for today. We are exploring this through a really fascinating stack of historical and economic sources, and we're going to see how this wasn't an overnight ban.
Right, it was gradual.
Yeah, it was a meticulous, multi-stage pedagogical process. We'll look at the severe resistance it faced from the wealthy elites, and ultimately how this ancient economic philosophy directly shapes the Islamic way of doing business today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can appreciate the cure, we really have to deeply understand the disease.
Absolutely.
When we talk about the days of ignorance, or Jahiliyyah, before the prohibition of riba, I'm trying to picture the actual mechanics of the economy. Like if they didn't have Wall Street banks or modern financial institutions, how did this system of lending and interest actually function on the ground?
Well, to picture it, you really have to realize Mecca was essentially the Wall Street of the desert.
Okay.
It was a fiercely laissez-faire mercantile hub. The dominant Quraysh tribe, they built their entire society around long-distance caravan trade.
Like the summer and winter caravans.
Exactly. Massive expeditions to Syria in the summer and Yemen in the winter. And funding those caravans required immense capital.
Right. It's not cheap to cross the desert.
No, not at all. So you had a network of wealthy individual lenders and tribal syndicates, and they were extending trade financing, but they were also offering a basic consumption credit to poorer people who just needed to survive.
I mean, I imagine enforcing a debt without a modern legal system or like a centralized credit bureau gets pretty intense.
Oh. It was entirely enforced by tribal power dynamics.
Yeah.
And the mechanism they used was called riba al-Jahiliyyah.
Okay.
This wasn't a standard modern mortgage where, you pay a fixed 3% over 30 years. The core of this system was a strict ultimatum.
An ultimatum.
Yeah. You take out a loan for a year. When the due date arrives, if you cannot pay the lender in full, they don't offer a polite grace period.
Right.
They approach you and basically say, settle the debt now or increase it.
Settle or increase. So if I can't pay, what does increase it actually look like in practice?
The principal amount of your debt was immediately doubled.
Wait, doubles, instantly?
Instantly doubled. And if you couldn't pay the following year, it was doubled again. It compounded exponentially.
That is mathematically terrifying. I mean, if you borrow the equivalent of like $1,000 for emergency supplies and you miss a couple of harvests, you suddenly owe $4,000, then $8,000.
Exactly.
How does anyone ever escape that?
Yeah.
Like, it sounds like the worst modern predatory payday loans, but on a societal scale.
They didn't escape it. That is the crucial point of the sources here. The social consequence wasn't just, a bad credit score.
Right.
It was literal, physical enslavement. If a borrower couldn't pay the multiplying debt, the creditors could legally seize their property, strip them of their freedom, and even take their wives and children into debt slavery.
Oh, wow. To work off the compounding balance.
Yes, to work off a balance that they could practically never pay down. It created a society with an extreme concentration of wealth at the very top and utter devastation in the bottom.
So if you are the prophet, and your divine mission is to establish justice and eradicate this oppression, you are looking at a system that the powerful elites rely on for their entire lavish lifestyle. You can't just flip a switch and say, interest is illegal starting tomorrow. The elites would revolt, and the economy would grind to a halt, because suddenly no one is lending money for the trade caravans.
Which is exactly why the Quran's approach is considered a masterpiece of societal reengineering.
Because it was gradual.
It took over a decade. It utilized a patient four-stage strategy to systematically change the moral consciousness of the early Muslims before dropping the heavy legal hammer.
Let's trace that timeline then. Stage 1, this begins while the Muslims are still in Mecca, right?
Yes, they are a heavily persecuted minority at this point. They have zero political power, no state of their own, and they are living completely submerged in this cutthroat mercantile culture.
So what's the first step?
The first stage is found in Surah Ar-Rum, verse 39, and crucially, it is not a legal ban.
Okay, so what is it?
It simply plants a moral seed. The verse states that whatever wealth you give through riba to increase it through other people's wealth does not increase in the sight of Allah. Whereas what you give in zakat, in charity, seeking the countenance of Allah, will bring manifold blessings.
The psychological shift there is subtle, but it's massive. I mean, in a society that literally worships the accumulation of capital and equates wealth with divine favor, this verse quietly decouples the two.
Exactly. It's telling the early believers, this system might make you rich on paper, but it is spiritually bankrupt.
It redefined success entirely.
It really did. It prepared them mentally so that when the legal ban eventually came, their hearts were already detached from the allure of usury. They were already conditioned to see charity and mutual support as the true source of abundance.
But morality alone doesn't stop an economic machine.
Right.
Like eventually the Muslims face such intense persecution in Mecca that they have to flee.
Yes, the Ijara.
Right, the migration to the city of Medina. Now they have actual political autonomy. They're building a state. So how does the law begin to tighten in this second stage?
Well, in the early Medina period, we see the revelation of Surah An-Nisa, verses 160 to 161. Here, the Quran issues a very specific historical warning.
A historical warning.
Yeah, it references previous nations, pointing directly to Jewish communities who had been expressly forbidden in the Torah from taking usury, but continued to do so anyway. The verses describe how they faced painful consequences for consuming people's wealth unjustly.
Wait, why pivot to history here? I mean, if I am trying to stop my new community from doing something harmful right now, I don't give them a history lesson about previous nations. I just ban it outright.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, why delay the actual actionable law?
Because an abrupt ban creates loopholes, whereas a historical precedent creates a universal taboo. By pointing to the past, the Quran establishes that riba isn't just some new arbitrary rule being invented for the Muslims. It's a universal ancient sin that has destroyed past communities across the Abrahamic faiths.
So it's like a profound psychological warning, like do not repeat the fatal mistakes of the generations before you.
Exactly. It elevates the severity of the practice right before the law changes.
Which sets the stage for the first actual legal prohibition.
Oh.
Which brings us to stage 3.
Right. Found in Surah Ali Imran, verse 130. This was revealed around the second or third year after the Hijrah to Medina, roughly coinciding with the Battle of Uhud.
Okay.
The verse commands the believers, do not consume usury, doubled and multiplied.
Doubled and multiplied. That phrasing is extremely specific. It targets the riba al-Jahiliyyah we were just talking about. Right. The settle or increase ultimatum that was literally enslaving people.
Yes, it surgically removes the most toxic, exploitative element of the economy first. It outlaws the runaway compound exploitation.
Okay.
And the sources show us that this wasn't just abstract theology. I mean, it was actively forcing people to make incredibly difficult financial decisions in real time.
Right. I saw this in the notes. There's a story from the historian Abu Huraira about a man named Amr ibn Aqyash. His dilemma is just universally relatable. He was drawn to the message of Islam, but his investment portfolio was holding him back.
Yeah, Amr had a massive amount of outstanding interest payments owed to him, and he knew that if he took the oath and became a Muslim, he would have to instantly forgive all that compounded interest based on this new revelation.
Which is a huge financial hit.
Massive. He didn't want to lose his wealth, so he kept delaying his conversion, hovering on the edge of faith, but unable to let go of his capital.
Until the geopolitics literally force his hand.
Right.
The Battle of Uhud breaks out.
The Meccan army is marching on Medina. Amr realizes his time is up. He decides he cannot let money keep him from the ultimate truth.
Wow.
He embraces Islam, leaves his wealth behind, rushes directly into the battlefield to defend the Muslim community, and is killed in combat, achieving the highest rank of a martyr.
He gave up an absolute fortune and his life on the exact same day.
Yeah.
That perfectly illustrates the immense tension of this transition. It proves that banning interest was costing real people their fortunes, and they were actively choosing faith over capital.
And that level of conviction is what prepared the community for the fourth and final stage, the absolute, uncompromising, total ban on all forms of riba.
Right, Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 275 to 279. I read the translation of these verses, and the language is staggering.
It really is.
It demands the immediate surrender of any remaining riba. It tells lenders they are only entitled to their original principal amount. The exact phrase is, neither inflict nor suffer inequity.
Yes.
But it's the ultimatum at the end that really shifts the gravity of the situation.
The Quran declares a war from Allah and His Messenger against those who refuse to abandon interests.
Declaring war from Allah is the ultimate final line in the sand. But the real test of that ultimatum wasn't going to be the devout, poor believers in Medina who had nothing to lose, right?
No, of course not.
The real test would be the wealthy pagan elites across Arabia who relied on this system for their dominance. I mean, nobody gives up their primary source of passive income without a fight.
Which forces us to look at one of the most dramatic diplomatic encounters in the historical record, the delegation of the Banu Thaqif.
Okay, set the scene for this.
We are now in the year 9 AH. The Banu Thaqif are a formidable, wealthy tribe based in the walled city of Taif. Out of the entire surrounding province, they are the last major holdouts still clinging to paganism and the old economic ways.
And they have a very dark recent history with the Prophet's message, right?
Yeah.
They didn't just ignore Islam. They actively, violently suppressed it.
Yes. They had just murdered one of their own most respected leaders, a man named Urwa ibn Masud.
Oh, wow.
Urwa had traveled to Medina, embraced Islam, and returned to Taif simply to invite his people to the faith. While he was standing on his roof calling the Muslim call to prayer, his own people shot him dead with an arrow.
That is brutal. So the leaders of the Banu Thaqif have the blood of their own chief on their hands. They must be consumed by guilt and terror, knowing Medina is growing stronger by the day.
They recognize the geopolitical reality. They are completely surrounded by Muslim-allied tribes. They cannot sustain a military conflict. So they send a delegation of their top leaders to Medina to negotiate their submission.
But they don't arrive with humility, do they?
Not at all. They are used to tribal treaty making where everything is a negotiation. They try to carve out a customized, conditional version of Islam just for themselves.
They sit down in Medina and essentially offer a plea deal.
Basically.
They agree to smash their idols, but they demand legal exemptions. They want to keep drinking wine, they want to keep committing zina, which is fornication or adultery, and crucially, they demand to keep their riba.
And the loophole they propose regarding riba is breathtakingly arrogant.
What was it?
They tell the Prophet that they will agree to stop paying any interest they owe to other tribes, but they demand the right to continue collecting all the interest that other tribes owe to them.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
We want all the revenue and absolutely none of the liabilities.
Right.
Is the ultimate elite carve-out. How did the Prophet handle that level of audacity in his own city?
Well, he treated it as divine law, not a tribal pact. He completely rejected their terms.
Good.
He quoted the Quranic verses prohibiting these sins, making it absolutely clear that Islam's principles of justice are universal. There are no special economic loopholes for the wealthy class.
So the Thaqif emissaries are now trapped in a terrible bind. They know they can't go back to Taif and tell their people they have to give up their wine, their extramarital affairs, and their massive usury profits. Their people will rebel.
Exactly.
But they also know if they walk away from the table, they face military annihilation.
And the sources give us a profound look into their psychological state at that moment. The delegates step away to confer privately. They weigh the military threat, but then they look around Medina.
What do they see?
They observe the daily lives of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. One of the Thaqif leaders points to the Muslims and says to his peers, "Look at the people around him. Didn't they give up riba and wine and zina?"
It's the ultimate realization of peer influence. Seeing the law lived out by a community validates the law.
It proves why the Prophet's 10-year pedagogical delay was pure genius.
Because it built the community first.
Exactly. Laws are completely useless without a moral community to uphold them. The Thaqif realized that it wasn't just military might forcing compliance, it was true internal faith.
Right.
Seeing the Sahaba willingly abandon these lucrative and deeply ingrained vices shattered the Thaqif's excuses. They realized if they can do it, we have to do it too. They returned to the Prophet and unconditionally submit.
I want to pause on the Prophet's behavior during this entire tense standoff. Because despite the fact that these men murdered Urwa, despite their arrogance and their hypocritical demands, the Prophet treated them with staggering grace.
He really did.
He didn't lock them in a dungeon to sweat it out. He ordered a special guest tent to be pitched for them inside the Prophet's mosque itself.
Yes. He offered them the highest level of hospitality and personal protection while refusing to compromise a single syllable of the divine law. He separated the dignity of the guests from the corruption of their requests.
That's a profound leadership lesson right there. So the last major holdouts submit. The system of Jahiliyyah is fractured. Which brings us to the grand finale, the permanent abolition of the entire ancient economic engine.
Yes, we move forward to the year 10 AH, or 672 CE, the farewell pilgrimage.
The Prophet is standing in the Urana Valley of Mount Arafat, addressing an ocean of over 100,000 pilgrims.
The farewell sermon is widely regarded as a foundational moment in human history. It's a comprehensive declaration of human rights, the sanctity of life, and profound economic justice.
He doesn't just offer spiritual platitudes.
Yeah.
He uses this massive platform to legally and permanently wipe the slate clean. He announces, everything pertaining to the days of ignorance is under my feet, completely abolished.
Yes.
He explicitly cancels all the riba of the pre-Islamic period.
Yes.
But what fascinates me is how he does it, because modern politicians, they usually find a way to exempt their own families or corporate donors when they pass sweeping financial reforms.
Right. They always find a loophole for themselves.
Exactly. But the Prophet does the exact opposite.
He leads by absolute example. He declares to the massive crowd, the first usury I abolish is that of Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib.
He starts by wiping out the wealth of his own uncle.
Abbas was one of the wealthiest merchants in the region. He had massive amounts of compounding interest owed to him, particularly by the Banu Thaqif we just talked about.
Oh, wow. So it all connects.
It does. The Prophet didn't start the economic reset by canceling the petty debts owed to the poor. He started by erasing his own family's massive portfolio.
That is incredible.
By doing this, he established undeniable justice. He reiterated the Quranic mandate right there in the sermon. You neither inflict nor suffer inequity. Your capital is yours to keep.
So the original principle is legally protected, but the exploitative surplus vanishes into thin air.
Precisely.
I mean, you cannot accuse a leader of corruption or favoritism when his first act of reform is to bankrupt his own uncle's interest empire. A stunning historical arc. We've moved from the predatory debt traps in Mecca through a patient four-stage revelation, overcoming the resistance of the elites, culminating in this final absolute reset at Mount Arafat.
It is a complete societal transformation.
But now we have to pivot. Because if you abolish interest, you still have an economy to run. People still need to do business. Let's dig into the actual mechanics of the Islamic way of business. Trade versus usury. The Meccan merchants actually had a very specific defense for their practices, and it's an argument you honestly still hear in modern finance today.
You're referring to the defense quoted directly in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 275, where the merchants argued, trade is just like a riba.
Yes. Their logic seems sound on the surface. They argued, if I buy a bunch of spices and sell them next month for a profit, my wealth increases. If I lend you gold coins and charge interest next month, my wealth increases. Both mechanisms generate a positive financial return over time. From a purely mathematical standpoint, what is the economic difference?
It is a brilliant question that cuts to the core of economic philosophy. The Islamic worldview provides a very distinct, multi-layered breakdown of why trade and usury are fundamentally opposites, not twins.
Okay, let's break that down.
The first major distinction comes down to risk versus guaranteed return.
How does risk legitimize profit? Like, how does taking a chance make it okay?
Well, in legitimate trade, which is known as bay, the seller assumes actual asset risk. If you buy inventory to sell, you face the real-world risk of depreciation.
Right.
The goods could be stolen, they could be damaged in transit, or market demand could crash before you even make the sale. You earn your profit precisely because you took on that risk and provided a tangible good to the market.
Okay.
In riba, however, the lender takes a risk-free return on money. The lender shifts 100% of the hardship, the market volatility, and the risk onto the shoulders of the debtor.
Let me ground this in a modern, everyday scenario just to make sure I'm following. Let's say I want to make some money in the used car market.
Okay.
If I go out and buy a broken-down car for $5,000, spend time fixing the transmission and try to sell it for $6,000, I have provided a tangible asset to society.
Yes, you added value.
Right, but I've also taken on massive risk. The engine could blow up on a test drive. The market for that specific model could tank. If I eventually make $1,000 in profit, I earned it by taking a risk and providing a working vehicle.
That is the essence of trade. Now, contrast your scenario with a riba transaction.
Okay, so if I operate as a loan shark and I just lend someone $5,000 so they can buy a car to get to their new job, and I legally demand $6,000 back from them in a year, regardless of what happens.
Right.
The car could get totaled the very next day. The person could get fired. But my ledger still demands a guaranteed $6,000. I haven't taken a single ounce of physical risk on the asset itself. I am purely exploiting their desperate need for cash flow.
That exploitation leads us perfectly into the second major difference, the nature of money itself. In the Islamic economic worldview, money is merely a medium of exchange and a measure of value. It has absolutely no intrinsic utility.
Meaning money itself doesn't actually do anything. Like you can't eat a gold coin for calories.
No, you can't.
You can't staple dollar bills together and live inside them to stay out of the rain.
Precisely. Because money has no intrinsic utility, it cannot be rented out or traded as a commodity to magically generate more money out of thin air.
It has to be tied to something real.
Yes. Money must be converted into something productive. A physical good, a service, human labor, something to generate a legitimate return. When a financial system simply trades money for more money over time, you are divorcing wealth creation from real, productive economic activity.
Right.
It creates a hollow economy built on ledgers rather than labor.
Which brings us to the third core difference, I think. Exploitation versus partnership.
Yes.
Riba profits off desperation.
Yeah.
The lender wins regardless of whether the borrower's enterprise succeeds or fails. In fact, sometimes the lender wins because the borrower fails, allowing them to seize the collateral at a massive discount.
We see that all the time.
But Islamic finance is structurally forced to rely on equity, on actual profit and loss sharing.
This is embodied in the concept of Musharaka. It forces the alignment of the financier's success with the entrepreneur's success.
So they're tied together.
Exactly. If I fund your new business under Islamic principles and your business succeeds, we share the profits based on our agreement. If the business fails despite your best efforts, we share the loss. The financier is deeply personally invested in the actual success and sustainability of the venture because their capital is at genuine risk.
They aren't just extracting a guaranteed pound of flesh from a failing business.
Exactly.
So practically speaking, bringing all this theory into the real world always raises a massive question for listeners trying to navigate modern life.
Of course.
If a Muslim today wants to buy a house or buy a car or fund a massive new factory, but they cannot take out a standard interest-bearing bank loan,
what is the actual alternative? How does Islamic finance function in a modern economy without interest?
well, the most common financial vehicle you will encounter for purchasing an asset like a house is called Murabaha. It translates essentially to a cost-plus markup sale. Okay, walk me through a Murabaha transaction step by step. Let's say I want to buy a house. The seller wants $400,000. I don't have $400,000 in cash lying around, so I go to an Islamic bank. What actually happens?
If you went to a conventional bank, they would lend you the $400,000, you would buy the house, and you would owe the bank the principal plus compounding interest over 30 years. That is a forbidden riba loan.
Right.
That's what we want to avoid.
In a Murabaha agreement, the Islamic bank steps in and actually purchases the physical house directly from the vendor with cash.
Wait, so the bank becomes the actual legal owner of the property?
Yes, the bank takes ownership of the asset, even if it is only for a brief period. And because they hold the title, they take on the legal and physical risk of that asset. Once they own it, the bank then turns around and resells the house to you, the client, at a mutually agreed upon higher price.
So they buy it for $400,000 and they sell it to me for, say, $450,000.
And I pay that $450,000 back in monthly installments over 15 years.
Correct.
Okay, I can hear the skeptic in the audience asking the obvious question here. Wait a second. The bank is still making a $50,000 profit on this transaction. The math looks remarkably similar to an interest payment. How is this actually any different from a conventional loan?
It goes all the way back to your used car analogy. Risk versus guarantee. It is halal, or permissible, because it is a genuine sale of a tangible asset where the bank assumed inventory risk, not a rental of money.
Okay, explain the inventory risk part.
Let's say the bank buys the house for you, and 10 minutes before you sign the final papers to buy it from them, lightning strikes the house and it burns to the ground. Whose loss is that?
Well, since I haven't signed the purchase agreement yet, the bank still holds the title. So it's the bank's total loss.
Exactly. They took the physical risk. That is the fundamental difference between being a merchant providing a service and being a loan shark.
Ah, I see.
The markup of $50,000 is a fixed trading profit agreed upon mutually upfront. It honors the Quranic mandate of lawful business by mutual consent. And crucially, if you lose your job in year 5 and are late on a payment, the total amount you owe cannot compound or multiply.
Oh, that's huge.
Yes, the final price was fixed permanently at the point of sale.
That makes total sense when you frame it around risk. The bank is acting as a merchant, buying and selling a real asset, rather than a moneylender renting out cash and letting a computer compound the interest forever.
Exactly.
And Murabaha isn't the only tool, right? There are other structures for different needs.
Absolutely. For instance, there's Ijara, which is essentially a leasing structure. The bank buys the asset, retains ownership, and rents the usufruct to the client.
Usufruct, that's a heavy legal term.
Yeah.
That just means the right to use and benefit from the asset, right?
Right.
Like renting the right to live in the house or drive the car, even if you don't own the title.
Exactly right. You pay for the utility of the asset over time. And we already mentioned Musharaka, the joint equity venture.
Right, where you share profits and losses.
Yes. The overarching theme across all these vehicles is that they require the financier to step out of the abstract world of compounding ledgers and interact with the real, tangible, physical economy, sharing an actual human risk.
This has been an incredible journey. We started in the brutal, predatory debt traps of Jahiliyyah, where compound interest was creating extreme wealth inequality and literal physical slavery.
It was a dark time.
Yeah, and we explored how the prophet didn't just smash the system blindly, but utilized a patient, four-stage pedagogical revelation to decouple his community's moral compass from the accumulation of wealth.
We saw how that moral foundation gave them the strength to accept the total legal ban, and how the visual proof of that moral community finally broke the resistance of wealthy elite tribes like the Banu Thaqif.
Ending with the prophet standing at Mount Arafat, wiping out his own family's wealth to establish a genuinely fair, trade-based society. It's a masterclass in structural reform.
It really is.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, we always want to leave our listener with a provocative thought. Something to chew on that brings this ancient history right into the modern living room.
Well, when we pull back and look at the macro picture today, we are living in a modern world constantly on the brink of global debt crises.
Definitely.
We see extreme leverage and compounding interest frequently crashing entire national economies. Think back to the 2008 global financial crisis, which was fueled entirely by toxic, highly leveraged, abstract financial instruments that were completely divorced from reality.
Right. It was a crisis built on renting money, trading debt, and slicing up derivatives.
Yeah.
It was completely disconnected from whether real productive value was being created for society.
And it is incredibly telling that even prominent modern venture capitalists like Peter Thiel, who was explicitly mentioned in our source materials, have pointed out the bizarre, unstable nature of our current financial system.
What did he say?
He noted how the abstract concept of money itself is valued and traded more than actual productive human activity. The hyper-financialization of the global economy has created a massive house of cards.
Which raises a really profound question. What if the ancient Islamic economic shift, moving decisively away from debt exploitation and abstract interest and forcing capital toward genuine risk-sharing, equity, and asset-backed commerce? What if that is exactly the structural cure the modern world is desperately searching for?
It's a question worth deep reflection. A financial system that legally forces capital to tie itself to real physical assets and real human endeavor, rather than allowing it to multiply abstractly on a server, might just be the ultimate antidote to the devastating boom and bust cycles that define modern finance.
It brings us perfectly back to our opening thought. You cannot fix a broken, unequal society by just swapping out a single policy. You have to change the fundamental mechanics of the engine.
Absolutely.
And maybe an economic engine built on shared risk, genuine partnership, and real trade is one that won't eventually drive humanity off a cliff.
Let's hope so.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the evolution and economics of the riba prohibition. We invite you to reflect on these timeless principles and perhaps take a closer look at how the mechanics of your own financial world operate. Keep exploring.